Hello, my name is Mark Lanier, and it's a great joy to join you via this podcast.
Mark Lanier. Mark, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
Well, I haven't been on Exegetically Speaking for some time.
I
but
know.
I've been trying to speak exegetically all of my life.
Well, you exegete all the time.
Exegete is my middle name.
Your middle initial is exegete. Hey, listen, it's great to see you, and it's good to have you back. Last time I think you were on, you talked about Idu.
I did.
And Matthew.
Yeah, I did.
Which is the
Behold. I did discuss that.
You did discuss that.
I could see it.
And I think you introduced me to Look It.
Yeah,
as the Lubbock version of that.
That's right.
Which I had not heard that.
Especially the way Matthew uses it.
Yeah.
He uses it for emphasis.
And we talked about the fact that on that podcast that sometimes translations don't even pick up that word, which I think is a bit of a shame.
Yeah. You wish, sometime I want you who've already done one Bible translation, I want you to do another one that we'll call the Emphasis Bible. And the idea is translate the Bible where you're using fonts and 21st century demarcations of emphasis.
That would be fun.
Pick up the emphasis in the original language that's missing. So where you may have a syndeton for emphasis, for example, in the Greek text, and you don't get that in English, but if you would underline or bold print or italicized font.
Yes, we have many ways of doing that.
Yeah, and we could get that part of the Bible translated as well.
That would be fun. Hey, this summer, which is the summer of 2023, you're doing a series in biblicalliteracy.org in Sunday school class that's about studying the Bible. So we want to draw people to that. And if you're really interested in exegesis and studying the Bible for all it's worth, I love that phrase from an earlier book, we want people to know about your teaching at biblicalliteracy.org. Yeah,
that was Gordon Fee's book, I think and that's a
right.
Great title.
Yeah.
I would urge them to do it. It's a morphing class. It's not one that I'm using a text on. It's not one that I've taught in this way before. So I've kind of sort of shunted off a little bit into just looking at some of the meta-narratives and some of the themes that as a hermeneutic or a principle help us understand some of the passages. And I'm starting out kind of already in deep waters, but a lot of that's because most people in my class have been studying the Bible for 30 or 40 years, and so it's a chance to add something, an extra layer of depth for them.
Yeah, well, that's really good. Today we're going to talk about James chapter 1, verse 1, in part because you're working on a devotional book about the epistles, and we'll tell people about that a bit later on another podcast. But I love the openings of all these letters. They're really kind of interesting. So what do you have for us today? What do you want us to think about?
Well, I would urge us to consider that James, most scholars recognize, was the brother of Jesus, an earthly brother of Jesus, who authored this epistle. And we know from reading the Gospels that Jesus' brothers were not too fond of his ministry, and you did not find them hovering around the cross, ministering to Mary, their mother. And something happens in James's life that radically changes him, and we know what it was. It was the resurrection of Jesus. You may think your sibling is being a bit high and mighty, or even a bit precocious, if not off their rocker, if they walk around with a Messiah complex. But here you've got a fellow who not only claimed to be Messiah, but was resurrected from the dead in a physical, visible, readily apparent, no pun intended, touchable, eating presence.
Yeah.
And that radically changes people's minds and beliefs and grows them into a deeper understanding. And that's what we have with James. And so you've got, I have two sisters, and both of my sisters know who I am. And I know who they are. And yet there was such an altering event that James grew in his understanding of who Jesus was, and it was no longer Jesus, my older brother. He's now the Lord Jesus Christ. And I love the way this verse sets out from the very beginning the change of heart for James. Now, there's more to the verse than that. But that in itself is one that's a stunning wake-up call to the reader.
Just the recognition that Jesus is Lord. I mean, he's not just older brother, like you said. Man, it ratchets it up way high.
Yeah, and add to it that first expression that James puts in here, that he says he's a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, a servant of God in the Hebrew language, which would have been the native tongue for James as for Jesus, though James, by the way, writes in very good Greek. I think it's one of the most compelling arguments that Jesus was probably quadlingual, but at least trilingual.
At least trilingual.
Yeah. But anyway, you've got that Old Testament expression of Eved Adonai. Eved is that Hebrew word that means servant, and Adonai is the way most people will read the name of God rather than trying to pronounce it, Yahweh, as we colloquialize it in English. And so you've got passages like Deuteronomy 34:5, where Moses calls himself a servant of the Lord, Eved Adonai. And we have good reason to believe that by the time of Jesus and James, already people were reticent to say the name of God and would come up with substitutes.
Right, yeah.
And one substitute would be just to reference him as the one true God, but another substitute to reference him as a Lord, Adonai. And so here you've got James, who takes that phrase, Eved Adonai, but instead says that he is an Eved of Theos, God, and Kurios, the Lord Jesus Christ. So to a Jewish reader, which it seems to be when he continues his greeting to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, to a Jewish reader picking this letter up, he is ascribing to Jesus the highest appellation there could possibly be. Jesus is Yahweh. He is the one to whom people would say, I am the Eved, I am the servant of God in piety and beauty. And so you've got the brother now seeing Jesus as God incarnate, as well as Christos, Messiah.
The Messiah. I think it's Richard Hayes that talks about in the Gospels, and I think you'd see the same thing in James, about Jesus being the embodiment of God, because Jesus in that bodily life lived among them, right, and had his being among them.
Which is what the Latin phrase incarnate references. You know, the incarnation is the embodiment of Christ, just using Latin instead of Anglo-Saxon.
That's exactly right. Well, that's a great reading of this initial text. There's much more to talk about there, even in that one. Just those who in the greeting, the word servant there, which I know Scott McKnight recently in a translation insists that we say, no, it's slave, it's not servant. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but we'll leave it for now. With that.
Slave has a pejorative connotation in America because of our history as a slave nation. There's no doubt that the Hebrews had slavery. And Eved could mean a slave, but it could also mean a worker and a servant in that way. And then they would have that special category of a slave that would notch their ear because they'd sell themselves, in essence, into slavery for a period that extends past Jubilee. And so they would notch their ear and be a notched ear slave. And there's no question that that's appropriate. But what I like about a Jewish slave is if you were a Jew and you became a slave, you had to have a role in becoming a slave. It wasn't enforced servitude. And so slavery in America, we think about buying and selling slaves, and you get a slave because you're strong enough. That's a misbranding, I think, of the doulos concept that might have been in the Greek, because the Greeks would go conquer nations and bring back slaves, and certainly in Roman times, where you are here, they would conquer and bring back slaves. But I think this is a Jewish connotation. And within the Jewish connotation, if you're a Jew, you are a slave only by voluntary effort. It's a volunteer army.
You
that's
will
exactly right.
So.
And I think God didn't come leading a train of slaves that he conquered. He came leading a train he was giving gifts to. And we choose Jesus as Lord. He doesn't force himself upon us at this point in history.
Yeah, it's a great way to look at it. Mark Lanier, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
I love this. Keep it going.
What a great conversation today. I hope you agree. Only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to us. Rate us today. Come on, you know you want to. If you want to study biblical languages, and of course you do, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Thanks to those who make this podcast possible, Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and John Luansma, who is our Wheaton-based director. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.